last presentation of today, which is relates to work by the Economic Evaluation Policy Research Unit. And in particular, I think it's Steve Pudney. It's a joint paper with Ruth Hancock, but I think it's you, Steve, presenting today. Is that correct? And the topic is
right.
Disability, income and quality of life outcomes for older couples.
Oops. That's worked. I hope you can all see the screen. Is that okay? And you can hear me okay?
Fine.
Good. Thanks. This is, as you said, joint work between Ruth Hancock and me in EEPRU, which is based in York and Sheffield. And this is really completely different from the previous two presentations, which were really very focused on specific issues. This is much more a kind of background study, which is intended to inform future work. And it has very broad scope. So this is really the first phase of a larger project. It's relating to disability amongst older people. And it has quite a long list of research questions, research issues that we want to begin looking at. And it's worth just going through this list. One is looking at the sensitivity of the kind of quality of life measures which are used in analyses for NICE, leading to cost effectiveness conclusions. So all of these cost effectiveness studies require some sort of quality of life measure. And of course, there are lots to choose from. And when we expand from kind of medical applications to the broader field of disability and social care, there are bigger questions about how we measure quality of life, what we mean by it. So one objective is to look at the sensitivity of the kind of measures that NICE analyses are often based on to different degrees of disability. We also want to look at other well-being measures, things like mental health, loneliness and isolation, life satisfaction. Some of these are aspects which are often mentioned in connection with disability, but which may not play a big role in the sort of work that NICE does. A really, excuse me, a really important issue for disability is what's become known as spillover effects within households, within couples, essentially. So if one member of the couple becomes disabled, that obviously has an impact on him or her, but there may be a spillover effect on the partner. And that could be because of informal social care going on within the couple, or it could be for many other reasons. So that's an issue we want to look at. We want to look at how public support and also private informal support that people actually receive is related to the severity of disability. There are questions about the gender equality issue in terms of access to support from different sources. And there's a final kind of macro question about the way that the burden of disability is shared between the disabled person and society at large, because public policy uses public resources to pay for various kinds of support. Now, this is a cross-section analysis of household data from two waves of understanding society, which is a major panel survey in the UK. It's a very large sample of almost 40,000 households, which has annual interviews with something like 100,000 adult household members. It covers the whole of the UK. It gives us information on income, things like benefit income as well. It measures, in certain ways at least, it measures disability quite comprehensively. So the measure of disability we're using here is based on 14 questions relating to the existence of difficulties with various activities of daily living, and also the severity of those difficulties if they are experienced. We know something about the receipt of care of various types, and there's a suitably wide range of indicators of health and welfare, well-being outcomes. But there are plenty of difficulties. Now, because this piece of work has such broad scope, and because there are lots of questions being addressed, there's lots of stuff here. What I've decided to do is to put lots of detail in the slides, but skate over most of it, so that if you're interested in what we've been doing, you have some more detailed stuff to look at your leisure if you want. So the next 3 slides are to do with one problem with this data, and it's the sort of problem that arises in almost all large-scale survey data, that when you ask people about their incomes, their receipt of disability benefits, for example, the receipt of social care services, how they pay for social care, there's a lot of confusion and uncertainty about the responses that some people give. Some people are very well informed, some people are quite confused. So there's a great deal of data checking and what's known in the trade as data cleaning goes on to try to put the data in as good a shape as possible. And these 3 slides are just some detail on how we've gone about that. It's absorbed a large amount of the effort that's gone into this project so far, but we're more interested for present purposes in the sort of results we're getting. This slide tells you something about the problems we face. So we have an index of disability, which basically measures the extent of disability and its severity. It's a fairly arbitrary measure, but all such measures are arbitrary to some extent. What we've done is to split it up into 4 groups. The group with D equals 0 is no disability. So these are people who report no problems with daily activities. And then we have 3 classes of disabled groups. One is mild disability, the second is moderate disability, the third is severe disability. Now, if you look at the table, about the example here is people living alone in the relevant waves of the survey. We have about 1/5 of people report no disability at all. The largest group report some mild disability, and these are people over the age of 65 generally. About 1/4 of the people fall into the moderate group, and then something like 15% into the severe group. And there's some arbitrariness about how we define these groups naturally. But if you compare the first row, which is the non-disabled people, with the last row, which is the severely disabled people, you find that the severely disabled people are more likely to be female. They're older on average. They have less education, so a smaller proportion of them have a degree level qualification. Income, permanent income, I'm calling this, which is a kind of long-term income, excluding things like benefit payments. But their long-term income is much smaller than the non-disabled group, and they're much less likely to be homeowners. So the problem for analysis, if we're trying to look at the impact of disability on welfare outcomes, if we just compare the non-disabled and the disabled group, we're not just capturing the effect of disability. We're also capturing the effect of the age difference, the gender difference, the education difference, the income difference. So somehow we need to eliminate these differences and try to compare like with like. And what we've done here is to use what has become quite popular treatment effect methods, which in this context essentially are just trying to match the disabled people we're interested in with otherwise similar non-disabled people. And there are various ways of doing this. We've chosen one particular way. The sort of well-being outcomes that we're looking at, this is something called SF6D, which is a measure of quality of life, which is one of the measures which is sometimes used in NICE cost effectiveness studies. This has a fairly typical distribution. It's a bit lumpy, but it's the sort of thing that's used to construct measures of the benefits of treatment to be compared with the costs of treatment in NICE analyses. We're also looking at another 4 measures of well-being. One is a caseness measure of mental ill health. So this is the number of aspects of mental health which seem to be problematic. And most people, as you see, report no mental health problems. There's a measure of mental well-being, which is a more general thing and has a much smoother distribution. Life satisfaction has been popular in some circles as a measure of well-being outcome. That's another one. And loneliness is an index that we've constructed just to try to capture the extent to which disabled people and their partners may feel excluded from society or isolated from society. Now, there are lots of tables here, and please feel free to ignore them completely. You can look at them if you want to dig into the detail. Just look at these bullet points at the end. First of all, what we're doing is looking at the impact of disability on these 5 different measures of well-being. What is striking here is that if we look at the impact of disability on the disabled person's well-being, no matter how we measure well-being, we get a pretty uniform, strongly significant impact. So across all these different notions about the way you should measure well-being, we're finding a very important impact of disability on that measure of well-being, and the impact increases as we go from mild disability to severe. A really important question is whether there are spillover effects on the partner of the disabled person within couples. So this table is giving you the example of the disability of a wife. There may be spillover effects on the husband of this woman. And generally, we're finding very little evidence of these spillover effects. None on the SF6D measure, which is the kind of NICE criterion, none on mental health of the partner, none on the loneliness expressed by the partner. There's a slight anomaly here. There seems to be a significant impact on life satisfaction. That's for husbands of disabled wives. When we do it the other way around and look at the wives of disabled husbands, there's no evidence of any spillover effect. So my overall conclusion here is that any evidence for spillovers within couples is really quite weak. And that's a potentially important finding because it's, I suppose, reassuring for NICE, because most NICE cost effectiveness analyses essentially are based on the assumption that these spillover effects don't exist. So these findings are sort of consistent with that in the context of disability. When we can also look at the impact of increasing levels of disability on receipt of public support. There are two forms of public support here. One is disability benefit. The other is the local authority care subsidy that some people receive. Again, we find, as you would expect, an increasing gradient as disability rises. And that, of course, is exactly what you'd expect because of the needs test that's built into the benefit system and the care subsidy system. There's some hint here that there might be a gender difference. So men living alone seem to get more care subsidy than women living alone, but the reverse is true for disability benefit. So is there, in fact, evidence of gender differences in access to public support? And in fact, we find there is a bit of evidence, but it's only a very small degree of difference, and it's only at the mild disability level. And it doesn't seem to work in one particular direction. So for disability benefit, the advantage seems to be for women. For men. For the local authority care subsidy, the difference seems to benefit women instead. But these are small differences. They appear to be statistically significant, but they are probably unimportant. We can also look at informal sources of support. This is informal care. For people living alone, informal care by definition comes from outside the household because there's no spouse within the household to provide the care. And here we find quite a big gender difference. So women living alone receive, on average, at the severe disability level, about 7.5 hours a week of informal care compared to 3.8 hours a week for men. There's a bit of a difference when we look at couples, but that difference is not statistically significant. So there's no evidence of a gender difference within couples. It appears that men look after disabled wives in much the same way that wives look after disabled men. But the really striking thing here is how important informal care from the spouse is. It completely dwarfs the number of hours of formal care and the number of hours of informal care from outside the household, if we're looking at couples. The last thing that we've tried to do here is to give some idea of the way the total cost of disability is being shared between the people experiencing the disability and wider society. The reason we can do this is that there is a kind of official figure for the value of health-related quality of life. If you look in the Green Book, which is basically a set of rules for government economic decision-making, there is a figure of £70,000 for a unit of health-related quality of life when measured in a kind of standard way. And that figure of £70,000 can be used to put in cash terms the kind of impact on health-related quality of life that we have estimated for as a consequence of severe disability. Now, these graphs look at what you happen as you vary that figure of 70,000. So you can use smaller figures or bigger figures. If we look at the 70,000 figure, then for people living alone, the share of the total disability cost, which is borne by wider society in the form of the cost of disability benefit, local authorities, social care, subsidies, and so on, so that's 28%. So a bit under a third of total cost is borne by wider society. If you look at people living in couples, that proportion halves. It's 14% is borne by wider society. And note that this assumes, as we've estimated, that there's no spillover effect on the health-related quality of life of the partner of the disabled person. So we've assumed that those spillover effects don't exist. Now, the difference between the result for people living alone and people living in couples tells you something about the importance of partner carers as an element of disability policy in this country. The gap between 28% and 14% is essentially being made up by the partners of disabled people living within couples. Okay, that's where we are at the moment. I hope there is going to be a second phase of this research. So far, what we've done is to use data from 2 waves of the Understanding Society Household Survey. That's wave 7 and wave 9, which are separated by 2 years. We can, in principle, add another wave now. Wave 11 will double that observation window to 4 years. And that means we should be able to look at what happens as disability changes over time. So if non-disabled people become disabled, we should be able to observe the change in well-being, income, and so on that is triggered by that change in disability. That one of the problems we'll face is measurement error. That there is some evidence that people are quite, I think chaotic is maybe not the word, but they're not necessarily entirely consistent about the way they report their disability status. So there may be measurement error, some degree of churning over time in what we observe as disability. But it will be important to try to look at the impact of the change in disability to see if the findings from the cross-section work that we've done so far on spillovers in particular, whether those findings are robust, whether we get the same sort of thing when we look at the impact of changes over time. And that will be phase 2 of this research, we think. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. If you could stop sharing the screen, it might be easier to, in terms of discussion. So we've got plenty of time for questions and comments. Okay, let me then ask you a question. So many countries organize their disability systems or their long-term care systems by separating between over 65s, one system, and under 65s, another system. And I think the justification for that is twofold. One is that they might value them differently, and there is potentially ageism. But the other is that there seems to be this belief that there are significant differences in people's outlooks towards their disability and behaviors. And if the disability, for example, is experienced from birth, as opposed to in older age when people are basically deteriorating quite quickly, losing their independence, etc. And so it has a different impact in their well-being, in their behavior as well. So to what extent is that something that you can, I know that at the moment you've only got two ways, so one transition, but this could be potentially, you could identify people with disabilities from birth, or at least having an interaction between some of the models and age in that, and divide between over 65s and under 65s. I don't know. Would that help?
That's extremely interesting, and it would be very nice to be able to do it. We can't, at least I can't think of a way of identifying people who've been disabled from birth. Yeah, and you have to remember the shortcomings of these disability questions as well. They are questions asking, do you have substantial difficulty with doing this or doing that? And how severe is that difficulty you have? The way people answer those questions may change. They may change because, well, who knows why they change. They may change because people expect to some extent to be a bit disabled when they're over 65, of course. There may be, well, there may be lots of things going on there. So I'm hoping we can get something out of the analysis of changing disability over time. It is going to be difficult. There are problems because we've done some experimental work in understanding society in the past about responses to a question on the existence of a long-standing health condition, for example. And we've found quite a lot of churning in the responses to that. Now, you wouldn't expect long-term health conditions to, change much from one year to the next, but for a surprisingly large proportion of people, they do. And then they may change back again. So you need to bear in mind the shortcomings of these disability questions, I think. One way forward might be to try to link them to specific diagnosed conditions, which then gives you a bit more of a handle on what the disability is. But then you tend to come up against the problem of small sample numbers. We're reducing the sample from all people down to over 65s. We're then looking at particular disability groups. You can then find yourself struggling to get a clear message out of quite small sample numbers. Those are the kind of problems we're struggling with, I think.
I was wondering whether, if you've got somebody with 5 ADLs at 40, that might not be more likely to be at, from birth. But I take your points. Ruth, there's a question from Raphael, but Ruth, did you want to come in on these points?
Yes, if that's okay. Really, it's just this issue of the difference between people who have been disabled since birth. I mean, Steve and I did some work in a completely different context a long time ago, looking at the differences between older people who receive attendance allowance, which we claim after you've received 65, and those receiving disability living allowance, which, as it was at the time, which you can claim before 65. And actually, I mean, given that at the moment our focus is mainly on older people, the transition we're likely to be interested in would be sort of between 50s and 65. And in that work, again, different context, different outcome measures, but we found surprisingly little difference between the two of those groups. In other words, I think the proportion of people disabled in the 65 and over age group who have been disabled from a young age would be very small, even if we could identify it. I agree that these effects might be quite different if you were looking at people comparing people in the 40s, but I think given that our focus is likely to remain on the older population, we won't really have enough going on in the transition of sort of pre-retirement age to retirement age to pick up that sort of thing, would be my expectation.
Thank you, Ruth. Raphael?
So thank you for an interesting presentation. Can I ask, I mean, you mentioned that spouse care, unpaid care by partners, that this was really very important in the care of older people. And also you found there were no statistically significant spillover effects. And I thought that combination was, on the face of it, seemed to be quite surprising. I was wondering whether you had an idea why that might be, whether it's perhaps possible that spouses, for example, adapt to the disability and the care that they provide for their partner, or whether there's any other explanation for that.
I can only speculate because we don't really know very much from the data. I think it's important to bear in mind that caring has both positive and negative aspects. Yeah, I mean, people tend to talk a lot about the burden of care, but looking after someone that you're attached to, you know, is a pleasure as well as a burden. So there are these kind of offsetting things. There's also adaptation. I think you're right to raise that people get used to the circumstances they're in. They adapt the way they organize their lives. So there's quite a lot of that going on, I think. I certainly wasn't expecting to find so little evidence of spillover effects. So I share a certain amount of your surprise. But I don't know. So much would depend on the individual circumstances, I think, and we possibly tend to hear more about the cases where there is some burden. But that's pure speculation. I've no idea, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other? Oh, sorry, Ruth, are you wanting to come back, or is that yeah?
If I may, I mean, it's just really, Steve will correct me if I'm wrong, but what we're finding is consistent with an awful lot of research, except we've sort of approached it a slightly different way and put some monetary amounts on it, that informal care by spouses is incredibly important in the care system. And, you know, if you took it away, there'd be real problems. But that's not the same as saying it is very detrimental to the quality of life of the carers. We're saying, I think that's what we're saying. It doesn't appear to be detrimental to their quality of life, but they are nonetheless saving society a lot of money.
The other thing that surprised me, Raphael, is that there was so little evidence of a gender difference. I sort of expected, you know, you don't really want to talk in terms of stereotypes, but I was kind of expecting that men who found themselves caring for wives would kind of find it more of a shock than wives caring for disabled husbands, on the grounds that a lot of wives probably do quite a lot of caring even before disability happens. But there seems to be very little evidence of that. I mean, you know, men look after their wives and wives look after their husbands. And they both seem surprisingly content to do it. Maybe marriage is a good thing.
Any other questions?
Could I come in on that point?
Sure.
Steve, I wonder if did you find, I don't know if you'll know this, did male carers get more help from services?
We haven't looked at that. I'm not sure that we can. We need to think about it. I'm not sure we can with the data we have. Again, I was a little surprised that we didn't find more evidence of gender differences in access to external support. It seems the only really striking thing seems to be that result on women living alone receiving more informal care than men living alone, and that seems, quite a striking, quite a definite result. I'm not sure where that comes from. It's something to do with the social networks that women build over their lives and that men build, I think, probably.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I think I'm just going on anecdotal experience here. I think when there is a male carer looking after somebody, they're probably social workers anyway, and maybe provide a bit more support, whereas there are different expectations sometimes, and so therefore it's easier, and not easier exactly, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure we can't identify formal support provided to carers in the data. That is to say, the questions about receipt of formal care are dependent on the disability of the individual, and the types of care that are identified don't explicitly identify a support for a carer. So I think we probably can't look at that, though it's an interesting point.
Well, there is, of course, the theoretical question of how you measure what is support for the carer, what is support for the person. And direct support to the person is also support to the carer, so there is that complication as well. And to some extent, then the total package that you observe might capture some of that. Any other last questions or comments? Okay, well, if not, thank you very much for 3 really interesting presentations, and for everyone who stayed until the bitter end. We are going to have probably another two webinars in this series in the next couple of months, and we will be, sharing the details as usual with so that you're aware of those. Thank you very much, and see you soon.